service announcements of Kissing Doesn't Kill that were 30-second spots. It's like a 2-minute film. And then I'm going to show a 13-minute film I made from the late 80s that's dealing with AIDS and HIV. And then I'll also talk a little bit about some of the kind of underpinnings of different artists or activists who did work that this work is drawing on. Okay, so we're at Welcome to America. We're getting sort of to the end of Gran Fury, basically, in terms of the body that we produce. This corresponds, this is from 1991. This is corresponding to Magic Johnson's recognition of HIV. I have to say, this is not my favorite Gran Fury piece. What you start to find in the later part of Gran Fury is these kind of crazy, declamatory, extreme statements. We need George Bush to end the AIDS crisis. Like, as if George Bush could end the AIDS crisis. In other words, what was strong in the early work of Gran Fury, boiling things down to a slogan, men use condoms or beat it, or read my lips, and that were clever and pop cultural, started to become stretched thin in our later work. And I think really one of the deep things that drove Gran Fury to the place that we disbanded as a collective was the recognition. It's really what your first question asked, which was the bankruptcy, because within the group we were only modestly diverse. There were 2 people of color, there were 2 women, and there were 8 white men, 7 white men, which was not a wildly diverse group. And as we started to go into other communities, or go especially into other cultures, this is where it really became problematic. We were getting invited all over Europe to do pieces, and it seemed impossible to us to go into another culture and to understand the kind of, the strength of our work in America was the kind of slangy pop cultural language we used. How are we going to go into France and do that? How are we going to go into Germany unless we had a kind of direct line into it? And also issues of national health care, socialized medicine, all of those things were different internationally. So it really became an issue of we decided that the work we did should be handed on to others, that the activist work we did hopefully would pave the way for some other work that people would do later, but that we had contributed in the way that we could, and that we reached a sort of end place.
That poster though seems really important too, because the program that Nike Just Do It and Magic Johnson had just come out as being HIV positive at that point, and so then taking that to me, just we need more than magic, was just really taking that whole kind of domination of pop culture through sports and the whole rhetoric of hey, here's a basketball player, and the discourse then was that yes, you too can be like Magic and just do it, and the whole kind of like the underlying politics of Nike as a symbol. So this to me seems like it's really important to have this kind of crossing of we're going to cross both the heterosexual over hyper-visualized African-American male body of dominance and virility and et cetera, et cetera. We're going to cross that with the Nike sloganeering of just do it, this individuality of, pull yourself up, and you have to buy your bootstrap, and everybody can do it. So it seemed to me like there was some important cross rhetorics going on.
I think it's a sloganeering. I think I agree completely that the opportunity that this moment presented in the culture was so important. And also it was a really fascinating thing to think retrospectively, because when you may not remember when Magic Johnson came out as being HIV positive, he was very sort of obscured about sort of how did he have HIV, and what was the deal about the HIV, and where did the HIV come from. And to us that was really striking, because he was a public figure, and people with HIV were, like when Rock Hudson came out with HIV, there was absolutely no ambiguity about where Rock Hudson got HIV. He was outed as being gay, and that was that. So that was a powerful moment. I think what ends up happening is that we realize that to boil down the kind of complication, there's a writer named Cobham Mercer, who's a black British writer, really amazing writer, and he calls race, class, gender, and sexuality the mantra, in a sort of mocking way. And he was like, there's a place at which the mantra becomes impossible to get at. Because it's impossible to take apart all of those different layers of identity and to extract them in a kind of pithy, soundbite kind of way. In a deeper way, much of that good work has been done in filmmaking or in essay writing or in kind of forms that allow and afford a greater platform of discussion. The thing that our work was, I think, best suited for was that kind of like zinc, you know, and then again, I think that's why Kissing Doesn't Kill is among the best work we did, because it's instantly identifiable. You visually get the piece, instantly read it, and somebody who doesn't really even know the politics of it can get the work. It's when the issues became really complicated underneath it that the idea slowed in. Or even in the Pope piece, we started to realize, my God, we're having to write huge, long texts with our piece, and this is starting to be, it's changing the dynamic of the work.
What was the name of that writer again?
Kalin Mercer. It's Kobena Mercer, Mercer. There is a black British film collective called Sankofa, Sankofa, and Kalin was associated very much with. There's another person who's kind of become more prominent associated with that group named Isaac Julian. Isaac Julian is now a figure, sort of, as an installation artist in the art world. Isaac is connected to Kalin and connected to Sankofa and comes from the same kind of roots of that. Sankofa is sort of mid-'80s, early mid-'80s. Kalin's work is really interesting. It's been anthologized in a bunch of places. He's really intelligent. He wrote actually very, very intelligently, very interestingly on the work of Robert Mapplethorpe and the so-called Black Book of Robert Mapplethorpe, the photographs of black men.
I have a question. So for me, I mean, I was young at the time when Magic came out, and a huge basketball fan. And the thing that was vague for me was he left the game because it was like he's not allowed to play anymore because what if he gets cut or does this or does that? And then a few years later, he comes back and plays again, and it's like it's okay. And I remember one of the most amazing moments. I'm a basketball nerd, okay, but he's in the All-Star game. Two things happen when he comes back. One, he and Isaiah Thomas embrace and kiss at midcourt. And two, he was the MVP, and he essentially just shot lights out. Like, he just had this amazing game. And so here's someone who, a few years earlier, I mean, as a kid in East Texas, I was like, death sentence, he'll be dead, like, really quickly. And then to see him come back and look healthy, and, you know, this is the first time I'd ever, seen two men kiss.
Well, I think what happened, one of the things that happened is so important to understand around what happened with antiretroviral medications is that the medications that exist now have basically made it possible for somebody who's HIV positive to be undetectable from a scientific standpoint. In other words, the parts per million that are measured to the antibody of HIV are tested when you have HIV. And if you take antiretroviral drugs, when they are successful, from a perspective of your blood, you no longer can transmit. So it's not impossible for somebody who's on antiretroviral drug to transmit HIV, but it's incredibly unlikely. Add to that the fact that in order to wound someone, basketball, you'd have to be bleeding into somebody's open bloody cut in order to get bloody transmission. It's so unlikely in basketball. But the fundamental shift that happened, and this is where the science has really come in, is that two things happened to HIV positive people. They ceased to become able to transmit the virus, and many of them had T cells. T cells are a marker of your blood that are measured that check your immunological health. And then people have T cells in the normal range. And so really, HIV, I don't want to put a bright pink bow on it, but HIV did become a chronic mental illness in a really rapid period of time. And that's one of the things I was trying to talk about a little bit in the first half of the section is you'd think that it becoming a chronic manageable illness and all of the people being saved from the death sentence would make all of us totally thrilled and okay. But perversely, there was incredible, I can't really articulate it now. I mean, I understand it emotionally more than I understand it intellectually. It was, everybody needs a good antagonist. When you're fighting against something really powerfully, it gives you a kind of raison d'etre. You know what you're doing in life. When that antagonist drops away, you question who you are, what am I doing, what have I been doing, what was all of that about? And so I think that was one of the really powerful things. I also think there was, on an individual level, for many of us, I was a 26-year-old kid And then I was in my mid-30s. I'm sorry, but I was not supposed to, at 27 years old, be having people bleed out on an emergency room floor and die. Like, you know, the kind of horrors I experienced in my late 20s and 30s are just, they're not normal. And I, you know, at the time, you didn't have any choice. So this was happening. I was like, okay, this is what my grown-up life is like. Once I had a minute to breathe and realized that was completely fucked up. What was that? Of course I went into a kind of depression. Of course most of us were like, what did we just go through? And I think that's a really powerful thing, that kind of action and counteraction that happens cyclically. And I think the same thing around a public figure like Magic Johnson, where there's a kind of terror around, oh my God, Magic's going to be dead in a year. And then you're like, oh, Magic's not going to be dead. He's back to his health again. And oh, he can play again. And then as people had to reinsert themselves into their life, there was I mean, and I had this with a number of friends. I had this also with friends who did not talk in a minute about one who didn't, but you know, that idea of people had to reinsert themselves back into life after thinking that life was over. It's a very difficult thing to kind of explain. You'd think that it should just lead to uncomplicated joy, but it doesn't. Because you've tasted your mortality and you've understood death in a way that you will never have an unshaded. I can say this truly about my own life experience now, is I will never have, I have an absolute clear sense of my mortality. I have no illusions about the fact that I'm going to die at some point, and that being close contact, and in some ways that's not a happy thing, but it was a hugely liberating thing as a person. If you have never encountered death or suffering in that way, most of you walk around terrified of it stalking you. And I'm like, okay, I've danced with it a bunch of times. I know exactly what it's like and how it is to partner with it. And that, although it was not a great thing to have experienced, was a very liberating thing. It just there was a kind of catharsis that you had to go through. There was a kind of horrible falling off that you had to, that rebounded out. And I think that the story of somebody like Magic, or any public figure that had HIV, that found the sentence turned around, commuted, had to sort of embrace and deal with. It's that kind of, I think it's a central kind of human dynamic. Anytime, you know, anybody who's had cancer, any of you, I'm sure somebody in this room has had some sort of brush with illness in their life, and if you have that kind of thing, it really changes you moving forward, thinking about it and understanding it. Okay, so we're kind of very close to the end of Gran Fury. This is a piece that was done in Montreal. Je ne souviens translates as "I will return." It's like it's a slogan of Montreal, and this is one of the examples of us doing a piece where we felt like we were trying to, you know, reissuing the American flag using the Canadian symbol. It was so misread in Canada. It was read as a kind of colonialist American vibe instead of a critique of America, and we just thought, okay, we can't go to another country and make work outside of the cultural context that we understand. So the very last official Gran Fury piece was called The Four Questions. I'll read them. It just says, do you resent people with AIDS? Do you trust HIV negatives? Have you given up hope for a cure? When was the last time you cried? This is it wheat pasted on the wall. And this, sadly, is my dear friend and own member of Gran Fury who died of AIDS. This is Mark Simpson, who in 1996, when the antiretroviral drugs were being introduced, didn't work for him. He died. He's one of the people who didn't make it through the gap. And so he's repasting this piece up. And this is a kind of, you know, radical change for Gran Fury, because what you can see, you can't even see the poster here, but it was a huge sheet of white paper with teeny, teeny, teeny text, like 14-point text. So you had to get really close to it to read it. And it was like us going like this. And, you know, we never talked about crying, or we never talked about emotion in our work before. And it was a kind of recognition of, like, sort of what had happened, how much had changed, and how that we were not going to ever really be able to rebound in a kind of easy way from it. So in 1995, right around the time the Four Questions were exhibited, there was an essay that we wrote. It's called Good Luck, Miss You, Gran Fury. It's in this book. I don't have a PDF of it, but I can copy the whole thing of it. Any of the stuff that's in this book, if you want, I can copy of it. And I'll just read a little excerpt of this. And this is an essay this is like a statement that Gran Fury made trying to explain why we were stopping, why we were disbanding as a group. Our culture is run on carefully crafted words and images. They are given tremendous authority and have the power to shape society's responses. It is worth noting that the images which have endured through the AIDS crisis are not the ones of activism, however. Rather, they are symbols of remembrance and reprieve, quilts, ribbons, and angels. The symbols and symptoms of our acceptance of AIDS, our acceptance of death, Acceptance may be an appropriate response to the tragedy of AIDS. It is not a political response. What does it mean when personal responses are confused with civic ones? In the case of AIDS, we are left without solutions for our constellations of woes for beyond the tragedy of human loss, such as the economics of healthcare, society's marginalizations of individuals and needs, the skewing of scientific research along lines of class, gender, and race, and the depletion of entire communities. Our culture's acceptance of these images denotes a complicity between individual citizens, AIDS organizations, and our government, where the responsibility for AIDS is consistently transferred elsewhere. Our government wants responsibilities privatized. When these images are backed by philanthropic organization, it enables the government to steer the responsibilities from governments to gods. And then finally, from 1989 to 1991, we were able to see our images circulate in a way we never imagined. Even if they didn't have the power to solve the crisis, they focused attention on it and acted as a rallying point, a cry for identification for those inside the movement. Our projects developed a second life through the press coverage that accompanied them, so that their influence was greater than the physical space they occupy. The Kissing Doesn't Kill project got media coverage across the country through wire services and public radio stations, and even spawned a debate over representations of gays and lesbians in the floor of the United States Senate. So, Gran Fury ended in a kind of very interesting way, which is that we just evaporated. We went out on a kind of high moment. We had many commissions and many people wanting to do work, and we just said, we can't continue to do the work. We did the 4 questions as our last piece, and we took all of our existing work and donated it to the New York Public Library and declared it henceforth in the public domain, no longer copyrighted, and then anybody who wants to use the work, so if any of you want to use or reproduce or share or distribute Gran Fury's work, you have the full right to do so. Interestingly, what's happened very recently is Gran Fury, not every member of Gran Fury, but a big core of us have reunited in the last year, which is insane. I sort of can't believe it, because this was, 1995 when we broke apart. This is now 15 years later, and we're now going to produce, because there's never been a definitive catalog. We never really were custodians of the work that we did, and so a lot of it's been, us going around talking about it. We're going to do a sort of definitive catalog about the work itself, but not just around the work itself, reproducing the context around the work, and the reception of the work and the discussion of the work, this notion of the palimpsest around the work, the idea of the layering and the kind of reactions around it, hopefully perhaps to inspire excitement, hope, confidence in others to think of using similar strategies or pushing those strategies into further places like we were talking about before the break. I mean, I think that's what's so intriguing to me. And I think, when I started seeing, particularly like out of the Pacific Northwest, I saw all of that kind of, eco-activism that was going on, or World Bank activism was going on, the strategies and tactics were being used. I took great, satisfaction in seeing that another generation had taken those kind of similar tactics and pushed them forward and found a way to use them and move them forward. So that's Mark. And then whatever, these are a bunch more stuff from the FBI, which I'm not going to read all the way through. What I think is interesting is how much of them is censored. This is a comparison between the Stonewall riots and the AIDS activist protests of the 1980s. And then finally, this is a bigger memo obtained through the Freedom of Information Act, which is interesting. It's on the very top of it. It's the Revolutionary Communist Party, RCP, Domestic Security Terrorism memo. And it goes through all the activities of the RCP, but it goes on and talks about a number of organizations. Again, I'm not going to read them all here, but it talks about ACT UP, it talks about WHAM, it talks about the Iranian protests, the Iranian protests from the 70s against the Shah of Iran. It goes all the way back into the 70s and talks about a whole range of political protests that are not unified by any kind of political or ideological points, but show that there was a kind of systematic tracking of any of these kind of civil disobedience tactics in the country during that period of time, which as a citizen I find alarming, as I do these enormous black bars all over all of the material. It's sort of striking, not so much what's revealed, but what is concealed and the stuff. And then in the end, just a number of more protests. And this is one of the very earliest protests at the White House in 1987. You can see that the police are all wearing rubber gloves. So what I wanted to do is just go through in a sort of relatively short time, a relatively speedy way, a number of references, I think, that bear looking at in relationship to the work we've done. So, here we go. So, first and foremost, going back into the 1930s in Germany, there's the work of John Hartfield. John Hartfield is quite famous as an anti-Nazi graphic artist who used collage and other strategies. This is one of his posters, from the period of time, and most of them were severe critiques of the Nazi regime. It was obviously quite persecuted within Germany by Hitler and driven out of Germany actually by the late 30s for the political content of his work. But the use of photomontage, the use of humor, the use of popular cultural slogans, the kind of reduction of things down to a kind of readable bullet point was something very powerful in all of John Hartfield's work and was very inspirational to all of us taking forward. And sometimes even making work that was not around language, was just completely humorous work, poking fun at figures in power. Then I think a really important, so critical, I think, from a kind of theoretical, historical, philosophical perspective, is the movement that was originally called the Electress International, but became known as the Situationist movement, the Situationism. So you may or may not know that, I assume you know about Situationism and the writer Guy Debord, who wrote a book called The Society of the Spectacle. Are you all? Mm-hmm. Yes, okay. So preceding Situationism in the mid to late 50s is a movement in France called the Electress Movement, like letterist is what it's called. And basically, the Electress, it was Electress International was their movement, and there were many posters. It's, this one says, if you believe you have genius, or if you think you have only a brilliant intelligent, write Electress International. And these were kind of initially just these kind of calls and cries to create community among like-minded intellectuals and political figures and students. And so the Electress originally sort of brought stuff together. This is, the war for freedom must be waged with anger. Again, this is the very early 1950s, and you see in this picture actually Guy Debord is one of the early Lettrist figures. This says, create your own little situation with no prospects. This is, again, another initial early poster of the Lettrist movement. And the Lettrist movement stuff is quite kind of elegant and tame in the beginning, their stuff. As they go on, you start to see more material. This is a wall in Paris from the 60s, trying to kind of replicate what I was showing before of those New York photographs, the idea of this palimpsest, the layering of all of these different flyers, texts, and materials that we find in Paris during this period of time. And then these are this is a transition into the Situationist movement. This is the poster that says, occupy the factories, counts on the maintenance of occupations. And these were the posters that were leading up to the famous protests of May of 1968 in Paris.
So when did the letters?
The Lettrist movement begins around 1951-52. In the syllabus that I'll send you in PDF, I've cited a number of Lettrist books. There's a few really good history books printed by Verso. There's one in particular that gives a really good history of sort of the early 1950s protest scene leading into the late 50s and 60s and the writing of the Society of the Spectacle and the movement of Situationism. And so, this idea that the work occupied two different levels. One was a very grassroots, practical, politically based agitprop movement that was about political protest, was about demanding change in wages or living conditions or the rest of it. But there was a secondary movement that Gran Fury is equally interested by, which was this kind of more representational ideological project, which was trying to get at structures within the society itself, trying to undo the way we read things and saw things. So the one thing we were trying to do is just get bodies out to the protests. But the secondary thing we were trying to do is make you look at people in a different way, make you look at representation in a different way. And I think there's something very, very powerful. You go back to that work in the 60s, and frankly, for any politically engaged work, it's essential to go back and understand the strategies of that work in order to build upon it. Then you see in Paris of 68 the kind of beautiful poetry of these kind of slogans that says, in French, beneath the paving stones, the beach. I love the kind of slogans that were these kind of slogans about the derangement of the senses that said, right beneath your feet, there is the sea. There's this kind of perspective shift and the using of a kind of almost lyrical strategy within situationism. First, the early letters and situationist works were absolutely agitprop. They were like, come out, protest. And then the later work started being these kind of aphoristic, poetic, mysterious texts. And I think that kind of power of those are really intriguing to me. And this is another one, consume more and live less. There's a ton of this stuff out there. If you do, just search, do a Google search on May of '68 graffiti. You'll find an enormous volume of this kind of work. And there's a kind of very powerful way that these anonymous, incantations that came from the wall to you and created a conversation. An idea of the power of working anonymously were really a kind of incentive for us to create the work that we made. Another one from that period of time, live without dead time, enjoy without restraint. There's also just the kind of idea, this incredibly romantic and really powerful notion that came out of the activism in the 60s of this idea of live without dead time. Like, live your life to the absolute fullest. There was the downside to having AIDS activism and the crisis of AIDS in the 80s was the kind of imperiled sense of life. We all thought we were going to die in 5 minutes, but the really incredible part about that is I can tell you almost everything that happened in the year of 1988 and 89 as if it happened a minute ago. It's incredibly vivid because I was paying so much attention that I think you find often in life in these kind of really powerful conflicts between, the personal and the political. Those things really give you a kind of different insight into your life experience. This is a piece of work by Jenny Holzer. This is now jumping forward many, many years. I studied with many of the language-based feminist artists at the Whitney program, so my own individual background is probably most influenced by having worked with, I worked most extensively with Barbara Kruger and a critic named Craig Owens, who died of AIDS. He's not quite well known now, but is an incredible critic. If you're interested to see as a kind of a side detour, Craig Owens' collected work on the late 80s language-based feminist work, I think, is really smart and intelligent. So, builds on a lot of the work of Roland Barthes and a lot of the other post-structuralist French writers. It's Craig Owens, O-W-E-N-S. And I believe the collected writings of his book is called Blasted Allegories, I think is the title of his book. So, and these, Jenny Holzer, these were created as small wooden postcards, what I'm showing you here, but basically she created them in a number of different formats. And they were just these kind of aphorisms. I first became aware of them. They first appeared in Lower Manhattan in the 1970s. This was actually the very first version of what would go up. They were maybe, I would guess they're probably 14 by 14 inches, small, just wheat pasted up. This is just one of them. Change is the basis for all history. The proof of vigor, the old is soiled and disgusted by nature's stale food, is repellent, etc. They would be these kind of visionary crackpot voices, never from the same perspective. Some of them from the left, some of them from the right, some of them from the middle, but these kind of almost incantory rants of language that finally became boiled down into these kind of aphorisms that she alphabetized. And so you can see the whole list of them. A little knowledge can go a long way. A lot of professionals are crackpots. A man can't know what it is to be a mother. A name means a lot just by itself. A relaxed man is not necessarily a better man. A single event can have infinitely many interpretations. A strong sense of duty imprisons you, etc., etc. And these kind of very mysterious and cryptic aphorisms were really compelling. This idea of using the kind of language of bureaucracy to speak out, and also kind of very powerful use of this, both in Jenny Holzer's work and particularly in Barbara Kruger's work, the shifting between the first person singular and third person. So from I to you, the way that the audience was spoken to and also implicated in that work was an interesting provocation, and something that was a very good example that we drew on. Again, this is more Jenny Holzer.
Now, there's an exhibit as part of the Pompidou Women Artists right now that's up in Paris that has Jenny Holzer and Kruger and shots from Scum Manifesto. I think, but a video loop of I shot Andy Warhol.
That's so funny. I didn't know. Yeah, no, I didn't know the Pompidou showing it. No, I didn't know. I think it's I think what's interesting is that this period of time Jenny Holzer starts in the mid-70s. Jenny Holzer probably starts making work 73 or something, most of it. And that group of artists, Jenny Holzer wasn't part of the so-called Pictures generation. There was an exhibition called Pictures at a gallery called Artist Space in New York. Pictures was held in 1977. Pictures included, oh God, I'll get it wrong. I know I'll get it wrong. It's like, you know, it's Cindy Sherman, Richard Prince, I think, Laurie Simmons, Barbara Kruger, Sherry Levine, Troy Brontuck, and Alan McCullum. Maybe there are a few other artists, but it's like they were artists who were doing media-based work, and they're artists. I assume you all know Cindy Sherman's work. You know, work that's self-portraiture work that was getting at the representation of female identity and getting at the idea of social and cultural images of women. This work, this Pictures work, represented a severe break in the art world because previous to this period of time, in the mid-70s, conceptualism and minimalism in particular dominated. So the idea of language-based work coming back in, but also it was notable in the Pictures generation that many of those artists were women. So it was a kind of like seismic shift of suddenly a lot of these kind of major artists of that period of time were women and sort of defined and changed kind of the kind of work that was being made in that period of time, and also shifted work kind of formalist, you know, very elegant sculptural work that was being done in minimalist and conceptual practices and shifted into kind of much more scrappy, much work that wasn't about mastery, work that wasn't about formal perfection, but was more about kind of content. A lot of the Pictures artists also chose to use photographic tools and techniques. Very few of them were painters, and so a lot of the work was about the idea of photographic representation. Those artists are basically almost a generation older than I am, and I studied with a number of those people. So on an individual level, I was influenced by that generation of artists, but I think in the bigger cultural movement, there was a shift in the art world from kind of individual, that kind of idea of the individual heroic artist to the idea of cultural collectives and alternative practices of cultural production through the late 70s and into the early 80s. This is a collected book of Jenny Holzer's book called Abuse of Power, Comes as a Surprise, which is, I assume, probably still in print. You can probably still get it from printed matter. And then a number of Barbara Kruger pieces. Again, using photo montage, building on John Hartfield's work. You can see the absolute direct connection between Barbara Kruger and John Hartfield. And, you know, Barbara Kruger, I mean, it's somewhat shameful. When I was at the Whitney program, Barbara was my teacher, so I was like, Barbara, where do you get your typesetting done? So, like, for Gran Fury's early typesetting, I was like, what font do you use? And so, read my lips. I went to the typesetter she used and used her font. She's like, okay, buddy, you're getting a little too close. Whatever. And then in the end, Barbara's been amazing about our work, because instead of seeing it as us stealing anything from her, she understood the notion of authorship was a kind of ambiguous construct anyways in relationship to this work. Your body is a battleground. Your main needs become science. So again, Kruger's work, I think you can see probably most obviously the connection between her work and what we did in Gran Fury's stuff. This was her project for Art Against AIDS on the Road, actually, done at the same time we did Kissing Doesn't Kill. Then Cindy Sherman, just as a sort of footnote, I don't consider Cindy Sherman's actual practice to be so tied to our work, but the conceptual framework around Cindy Sherman was informative, I think, to Gran Fury's work and the thinking of it. Again, Kruger, Sherry Levine, and Holzer probably being the most, particularly Holzer and Kruger being the most influential directly on our work.
What was that font you borrowed?
That font is Future Extra Black. This is an early work of Richard Prince. Richard Prince has appropriated advertising work and done a whole lot of work over the last 20 years. He started out as being part of the Pictures movement. He did a sort of straight appropriated, rephotographed work and has now gone on to make paintings. His work is almost uncategorizable based on the early roots of it. This is early work of Sherry Levine, where she took fashion photographs and cut them out in the shape of presidents and dealt with a kind of perceptual gap so that you saw a woman through a man, which was a kind of very simple idea, but a kind of very powerful conceptual idea that in our early work I think was quite interesting. The idea of looking at presidency and sort of this idea of looking back at women. A lot of this work is related, the Pictures generation work is related to the work of Laura Mulvey. You guys have to fucking know Laura Mulvey, yes? You Anyone not know Laura Mulvey? Laura Mulvey is visual pleasure, and what is the name of that essay? God. It's Laura Mulvey is a...
Something painful in there, too. It's like pleasure and something bad.
Laura Mulvey is a kind of fundamental critic from the 1970s, a British critic who wrote about the gaze, G-A-Z-E, the look, and basically talked about the gaze as a masculine look. Talked about the notion of art history in relationship to, men look and women are looked at, to kind of boil her writing down into a sentence. And it was a kind of rereading of Western culture and Western art history through this kind of idea of the patriarchal or male gaze. A lot of the work of Cindy Sherman and Barbara Kruger and Shirley Levine and all those artists were talked about or thought about in relationship to Laura Mulvey. Interestingly, the artists themselves didn't necessarily think of their work in relationship to Laura Mulvey, but critics and writers did very much. This is an artist named Hans Hacke. It's H-A-A-C-K-E. Again, this will be on the syllabus I'll send you. This is a piece about American cyanamide, and it's like, I'll read you the text of it. It says, American cyanamide is the parent of Breck Incorporated, the maker of shampoo which keeps the Breck girls' hair shining and beautiful. America cyanamide does more for women it knows. We really don't run a health spa, and therefore those of its female employees of childbearing age who are exposed to toxic substances are now given a choice. They can be reassigned to a possibly lower paying job in the company, or they can leave and look for another opening, or they can have themselves sterilized and stay in their job. 4 West Virginia women chose sterilization. American cyanamide, where women have a choice. So it's this idea of making a kind of mock advertising where you're actually doing political critique within it. Hacke precedes us at least by 15 years. Hacke's work is, Hacke was doing work in the 70s. Famously, Hans Hacke was censored at the Guggenheim Museum in the 1970s. The detail of that is too long of a story to go into here, but he was one of the kind of wave of political action artists who were doing work within the art world and stirring up trouble. These are 2 other figures. They're posters of the period of time. This is a poster by Hannah Wilke, who's sort of critiquing the coalition of Marxism and art during the 70s. This is a poster by Robert Morris, very famous of the period of time, of the artist himself, sort of sadomasochistically clad in chains. And in order to kind of react against that piece, Linda Benglis famously did this ad in Art Forum, which is her with the dildo advertising her show, which this is, late 70s, shocked everyone completely to death. And this idea, again, about male and female identity. This artist is probably the least known of the artists I'm going to talk about here, but I think in some ways the most interesting and most relevant for the work we did. His name is Robert Heineken. His work has been collected. His work since his death, he died probably 5-7 years ago. He's been the subject of a retrospective at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago that traveled a number of places. And so his work is, findable. If you look him up again, it'll be in the syllabus I send you guys if you're interested in finding him. And what he did is super intriguing and directly relates. It, for me, is the kind of connection to the work we do with the New York Times piece, which was he went during the 1960s, in 67, 68, 69, and took magazines, Time among others, many of them, and then silk screened on top of the pages of the magazine the famous Viet Cong photograph, and with no commentary whatsoever, just like using this kind of critique of this hideous image of violence, of war, directly on top of these magazine images, and sort of collided them together and remounted the magazines back together and put them on the newsstand. So people would have a kind of unexplained, unframed intervention in the magazine. They'd open up and there'd be Ally McGraw, an advertisement with a soldier holding 2 decapitated heads, having to try to make sense of it. And the kind of stealth bomb technique that he used in this work, the idea of making a kind of decoy representation that looked like something else but functioned in another way, was a really powerful clue within Gran Fury's work to think about how we could work within existing power structures and use them. I found it interesting. I actually studied at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago with his wife. a woman named Joyce Namanis, who's a photographer, did work somewhat like Robert's work, and that's how I became aware of his work. And the influence in Gran Fury, I think, would not have happened had it not been for the fact that I studied with his wife. He then later did work that's quite interesting, where he then excavated magazines. So he cut out magazines, pages of magazines, looking for the kind of juxtaposition of the image that happened, and made these kind of surreal and really peculiar collages about sort of the kind of odd poetry that happened, the weird erotic juxtapositions that would happen of these different bodies and the layers of the magazines. So what you're seeing of that man is cut through the page on top of it. The Guerrilla Girls, another famous art world collective. Gran Fury did have an aborted attempted collaboration with the Guerrilla Girls. The Guerrilla Girls, I don't know if you know them, but they're a self-proclaimed feminist art organization in the art world that dresses as gorillas when they appear publicly, and they basically have existed a lot to proclaim the inequity of the difference between men and women in the art world, a lot of times just pointing to the difference, like in the Museum of Modern Art, how few women are in the permanent collection. When Gran Fury went to collaborate with the Guerrilla Girls, they came to the meeting in gorilla suits. And we said, we can't collaborate with you if you have a gorilla mask on. We swear to you, we'll sign something if you need us to not admit to who you are as people. But human to human, I can't work with you for 3 weeks like with a gorilla mask on. It's just not going to work. And they didn't take their masks off. That was the end of that. They didn't want to work with us. It was masks or not at all. I respected the rules of their collective, and the reason they wanted it was for anonymity, but we were like, and it's also an odd thing because the membership of the Guerrilla Girls is somewhat of an open secret in the art world anyways. People know who it was anyways, so we were like, just keep masks off. Anyways, so this is one of their pieces where they basically just are outlining all the kind of difference in difference for women and men in the art world. You know, the number of blacks at an art opening is about the same as one at your garden parties. Many museum trustees are at least as conservative as Ronald Lauder. Because aesthetic quality stands above all, there's never been a need for affirmative action in museums and galleries. Most art collectors, like most successful artists, are white males. Women artists have their place. After all, they earn less than 1/3 than what male artists earn, etc., etc. This is a piece by John Baldessari, who's a conceptual photo artist. Not so directly connected to Gran Fury, but this is the piece that he did for Art Against AIDS on the Road. And the underlying conceptual use of photography and collage use of photography in Baldessari's work, although not as connected directly to our work as figures like Barbara Kruger, has a place for sure. This is a piece by Lorna Simpson. This is also a bus shelter that was done. Lorna Simpson is an African-American photographer, artist in the United States, quite prominent. This is Art Against AIDS, Robert Mapplethorpe's photograph that was done. I wouldn't say Robert Mapplethorpe's a reference for Gran Fury at all. I'm including this more just to give a sense of what Art Against AIDS did and included in their work. This is Alfredo Jarre. This is a piece he did in Times Square, the Spectacolor billboard, and they were political texts that were done openly. It's interesting to think like you could probably never do such a thing in Times Square anymore in terms of the kind of work we did. I was thinking about the Freedom of Information Act. I was thinking about some of the protests that we did, like when we took the Wall Street money and went into the stock exchange and threw the money now. I mean, you'd be arrested and you'd have federal charges pressed against you for any of this stuff. In New York City, you can't, photograph on the bridges. You can't do almost anything anymore. So the idea of how the notions of domestic terrorism have shifted so much in the last 15 years is a little shocking. This is an artist not so much directly connected to Gran Fury, but I feel it's important to kind of acknowledge this artist, and if you're not aware of him, for you to be aware of him. His name is David Vonarovich. Again, it's too hard to spell it'll come when you get the syllabus, his name will be on it. It'll be in the section called Influences and Backstory. David Vonarovich, this is a photograph taken by a photographer named Peter Hujar. Hujar is Hujar. Peter Hujar, sadly, has been eclipsed by Robert Mapplethorpe. But for those in the know, if you look closely at the work, Peter Hujar's work precedes Robert Mapplethorpe's, is far better than Robert Mapplethorpe's work, and Robert Mapplethorpe clearly borrowed heavily from Peter Hujar. Peter Hujar basically did kind of very simple, compelling portraits of downtown New York artists and figures, often taken against very simple backgrounds, and kind of very powerful work. He died of AIDS. He and David Vonarovich were lovers. So this is Hujar's photograph of David Vonarovich. It's not David Vonarovich's work.
But would you say that the writing, like Closer to the Knives and that kind of literature that was coming out, High Risk did an anthology, that was very much, or was it separate? Because it often seems that the visual world and the literary world are doing this side by side.
Your point to really
talking to each other, but not in direct ways.
David, it's why she's touching what's I think so interesting about this artist. This David Vonarovich grew up in New Jersey, had a very rough growing up, was a sort of street kid, had a really kind of tough time, had a very abusive family life, came to New York City, came out very young, was gay, lived in New York City through the mid-70s and died of AIDS, probably like 93 at maybe age 38, incredibly young. The funny part is that he was older than me when he died, so I always will still think, now that I'm 48, I'm older than David by a decade, but I still like, David's older than me. No, he died at 38. David did, this is what you're referring to, is David did a number of things. David wrote, and he wrote probably the most famous book is called Close to the Knives, which is a beautiful collection of essays. David also made photographs. This is one of his photographs. It's called Silence Through Economics. He also did paintings and drawings. But what he did that's kind of evaporated because now David's dead, it's not known so much, is that David, the text, I don't know if you actually know this, but to the texts in Close to the Knives, David used to appear and read them in a kind of performance style and projected behind them, a little bit actually like Adversarial did last night. It was like the first time I'd seen someone do that since David, actually, which was he'd project like black and white films behind himself and just stand up and read these kind of incredibly powerful texts. And they were personal texts, political texts, texts about the kind of culture, about sort of the society that he was living in. He's a really intriguing artist in terms of sort of what he represents, the shift between the 70s and the 80s. He's an artist I don't think would have ever defined himself as an activist artist at all. In other words, he didn't have a political message. He really wanted to make work about his own life experience. But in making work about his life experience, his work was inherently political, which was kind of compelling about it. This is an intriguing series he did that was called Rimbaud in New York, where he took a picture of Arthur Rimbaud, taped it to his face, and photographed himself in a number of sites. Probably the most interesting is the lower right-hand side. You see the piers in New York City. Those of you, probably none of you ever were around or knew this because I never even saw it, but in the 70s in New York City, all the waterfront in the west side of New York City and the Hudson River had piers which were kind of rotting and crumbling, which were often used for people would go and have public sex in them. And so this was a kind of, him going and taking his photograph in all of these kind of different places that had meaning to him. This is a really powerful piece of his. I'll just read a teeny piece of it. And this is a photograph of David as a child. It says, "One day this kid will get larger. One day this kid will come to know something that causes a sensation equivalent to the separation of the earth from its axis. One day this kid will reach a point where he senses a division that isn't mathematical. One day this kid will feel something stir in his heart and his throat and his mouth. One day this kid will find something in his mind and body and soul that makes him hungry. One day this kid will do something that causes men who wear the uniforms of priests and rabbis, men who inhabit certain stone buildings, to call for his death. One day politicians will enact legislations against this kid. One day families will give false information to their children, and each child will pass that information down generationally to their families, and that information will be designed, etc., etc., etc." He goes on, and it's, "All this will begin to happen in 1 or 2 years when he discovers he desires to place his naked body on the naked body of another boy." Really beautiful work, I think. Really powerful work about sort of the collision between the personal and the political. Another work of David Vonarovich's, it's photographed from the Natural History Museum, but it's a work that, like him expressing in a kind of poetic and lyrical way the feeling what the late 80s were about and the death of AIDS. Those of you who are not American maybe don't know, but one of the ways that buffalo or bison were killed in the frontier west where they were driven over the cliff. So when cowboys wanted to make a big kill of these animals, they would drive them to the edge of the cliff and push them, and animals would panic and fall over, and then there would be a slaughter at the bottom, and you would collect all the dead carcasses. And this image became a really kind of powerful lyrical image for David about what the feeling of the late 80s and all the kind of rapid death of people was about. Again, another piece of David's really beautiful, interesting text-based work, collage-based work. And these are all David von Rovich. And then finally, we have Felix Gonzalez Torres. Felix Gonzalez Torres was a member of the collective called Group Material. Felix Gonzalez Torres went on to be probably the most famous member of that collective, of any of the collectives. I assume those of you who are knowledgeable of the art world are aware of Felix's work. The art in this piece is actually the billboard on the right side, which is a picture of an empty bed. And that was a bed that he shared with his lover. Felix made these kind of very lyrical, poetic, personal work that had a kind of political dimension to it. They worked within the kind of tropes of conceptual minimalist sculpture, but brought within conceptual minimalist sculpture a kind of content. These were his pile pieces, candy pieces. They're all over the place in major museums, and generally what they were they're defined by the body weight of Felix and his lover. So their physical weight in candy was dropped into the corner of the museum. Visitors were allowed to take a piece of the candy, both as a kind of notion of taking a little piece of the body away, and also about the ephemeralness of life. The idea that the piece was a kind of, and also it was a kind of, funny, witty, minimalist pile in the wall in the corner of the gallery. Much of what happened in the late 90s, those of you who are in the visual art world are aware of this. There are figures like Rachel Harrison and other artists who are doing so-called scatter art, much of which is art happening on the floor, which owes heavily to the work that Felix Gonzalez Torres did in the 90s and early 2000s. And this is a piece he did called Perfect Lovers, which are just two clocks timed exactly together. That's that. That's what I wanted to show of that. Okay, so I want to show in the remaining time, we have two last things. No, we don't have any time, so we're going to break. It's one. So when we come back, I'm going to pick up and just show two last pieces of video that relate to I'm going to show a piece I made from 1989 called They Are Lost Division Together, which is a scratch video that I made in the late 80s dealing with media representation of AIDS. And I'm going to show a 2-minute short film of Gran Fury called Kissing Doesn't Kill. And then I'm going to seg onto other work. This will be the sort of end of the time that I'm going to talk about activism in a direct way before we break and go have our lovely lunch at the Hotel LA. Does anyone have any discussion, comments, questions?
There's a lot. When I lived in Oaxaca a couple of years ago before things got really heated there, and there's a lot of this, like the graffiti. There's a lot of little phrases and little details that are like written that are very similar to what you were just showing us. It's really amazing. Like one of them was like the Taliban is here, and then underneath it said Yanks go home. I just tons and tons of pictures, and there's lots of stencil art that it's using this like sort of graphic images.
What do you think? What do you all? I assume you guys know the work of Banksy.
Yeah.
What do you all think of Banksy's work? I mean, it's so hard for me to have a take on it because of I can't actually comprehend that's art star collectible. I mean, it's like blue chip art.
Yeah.
It's kind of...
They just did a movie too, right?
They did. They just did, which is done incredibly well in the States. People are going like in droves to see the movie. Those of you who don't know Banksy, Banksy is a graffiti artist, English, who goes by the name Banksy, which is a pseudonym. He makes figurative, stencil-based work. Doesn't really, that I'm aware of, correct me if I'm wrong, doesn't really have a political content to it, does it? Really?
I don't think so.
It's a kind of...
He's done some stencils on the wall, the wall that the Israelis have built. He's done some stencils on there that are quite interesting. And also, he's done some interventions in museums. Like he's walked into museums where he's placed, when it wasn't a stencil, it was like a painting. And, and left it, and was able to leave it there. And it took like 3 hours for someone to discover that this wasn't part of the collection. So his early work is he's done...
That's my impression is the earliest work was kind of politically driven work, was interventionist work.
Right.
But the later work, the work now, I haven't seen this film, so here's the later work, I'm slightly confused how that work has crossed over into the art market because it's ostensibly supposed to be work on the street, but it's...
He's also done a stencil of the Holocaust survivors, well, not survivors, like this typical kind of image of the Holocaust prisoners with purple lipstick. I don't know if you've seen that. And it was, I mean, I don't know, I can't remember all the details, but it had to do with the idea that apparently when like provisions came or supplies came, there was this need to kind of, like, the lipstick was a way for them to kind of become human again, and you know, so he's done that stencil, which is quite interesting as well.
So those are like really like directly, like you would say, well, these are representing political themes, but like the really, I think the more interesting stuff these artists started doing was those animatronics. Like he took over a gallery and he made like little, he made not a petting zoo because you're not allowed to interact actually touching it, but like little fish sticks that are swimming in an aquarium, or like chicken nuggets that are like playing around, and none of those are available. No one can buy them or anything like that. And I think like he has a really strong, like if you start looking at his figures, a lot of artists, there's always these human characters, but then there's always also this animal element in his work. And I wonder if he's got some sort of environment that seems kind of cheap. But
how does the work exist in the how is the work collected? That's the part I've never understood of Banksy. Like I was aware of Banksy when Banksy first started appearing in New York and was intrigued. I was like, oh, okay. Then I kind of lost the thread of it, and this is more reading than knowing. I know that he's collected abroad, but wow, I don't understand it because he doesn't have gallery presence or museum presence. What is the market for the work? How is it distributed or circulated?
Well, I mean, he sells his books in Urban Outfitters, right? But I don't know. I suspect that he must get some sort of commissions because he'll make massive wall murals, you know, and then like some city council will come in and buff it out, and that'll be a big controversy because someone in that community says, "Hey, we really wanted that," and it's not explicit that they paid him for the materials, but that like someone nearby really wanted it on this wall, and then there's the question of like, well, who has what kind of influence in that context?
I have a friend in London, like 10 years ago. She bought one of his pieces for £30,
right? And
now it's like it's worth a lot.
No, I mean
it's an actual like.
It's there's another lesser known woman named Swoon, bizarrely, and like you took the name of my movie. She does graffiti work kind of related to his work. I was aware of that work like around 2000, like 1998, 99, when it just seemed like street work. What's confused me is, I'm still trying to understand it, is the transition of what happened in the last maybe 4 or 5 years, where, because someone has got to be financing that work, you know, at really large scale. So how is that functioning? And also, what does it mean to the kind of outsider status of graffiti-based work when it
goes to the gallery?
Well, the big thing
what does that mean?
Was,
you know?
I think the Wooster Collective was a really key moment there. Right, and that was their response to 9/11. They were living, I don't know where in Manhattan, but they just started walking around and started taking pictures of all this ephemeral, you know, art and then responses and the notes people were putting on the walls. And that site suddenly, like, they had so much graffiti on it that suddenly people just really latched onto it, seems. And that was like 2001. People just seemed to really. I live in Atlanta in the southeast, and we just had this massive conference about living walls or whatever. And I mean, I was here. I don't know how well it worked, but that seemed to me, in my memory, which is the Wooster Collective website, seemed like a really big thing to happen.
I'm interested in the conversation of is there like. You know, the idea of when you lose your antagonist, how you define yourself, or when you're making work that's adversarial against something. And so what happens when you make that kind of work and then it is no longer against something in a kind of oppositional way? What does that mean to the critique of the work? Or does the work by necessity, the content of the work change? In other words, like the early work of Banksy's is angry and pointing to a specific thing, but as the target moved, the work just by nature moved. It didn't make the work any better or worse, it just changed it because of what happened. I don't know. It's also interesting because there is, what I find interesting, you should go, but I think it's so intriguing. There's been a huge interest in New York. Those of you in New York, White Columns, which is a nonprofit space, is having an exhibition starting in September of AIDS activist work.
Oh, really?
So so Gran Fury's work will be, it's sort of hideously installed, but whatever, we don't care, because we're like, we're not gallery people, but it looks ugly. It's like, make it look better. But it's interesting because there's been a kind of resurgent wave of interest around activist work, and because of that show, people were like, came to Gran Fury and said, you guys need to publish a book, we want you to reconsider your work. And for a long time, you know, from probably 95 to 2005, you did not make politically engaged work in the art world very much that I was aware of. You just didn't see it. It was considered completely out. It was like old-fashioned work. So I'm interested about the churn and what's happened. What is the wave of work that's being made, public-based work that's being made that's politically driven? I'm going right back to YouTube tonight, checking that out, because I'm interested to look at those different layers of work. And as we talk for the next few days, I'm curious at any resources you guys have that way.
Yeah, there's also a group that I work with called Porta Nostra, and they're based out of San Francisco, and Guillermo Gomez Peña, Roberto Cifuentes, and Michelle Ceballos also do political performance art. And one of their first pieces, they crucify themselves on the border of Mexico.
Oh, I know. I saw that piece.
Yeah. So we do a lot of that kind of work. So it's always interesting too.
It's just interesting because the tactics and strategies will continually change.
Yeah.
And also, I don't know if any of you saw the Marina Abramovic show this year at MOMA. So when you think of the crucifixion piece on the border and then the piece that she did and how those things echo, and I had such complicated feelings about that Marina Abramovic show. It's like intensely complicated feelings about it.
Oh, really? That's great. I actually worked.
I think it's really powerful, but I also like I don't know what it means in MoMA. Fetishized in the way that it is. The thing that really freaked me out was in I forget, but one of the New York magazines did like a glossy spread. You know, those of you who don't know, she's a performance artist who does kind of durational performance art. She's like the pioneer of a certain kind of durational performance art, which was like a lot of times about time-based work that involved, you know, pushing the body to a limit or whatever. One of the pieces she does is just sitting and looking all day. 9 hours, and there's a chair sit across from you, and she'd sit the entire day. So they photographed all the people looking, but it was like, you know, they did the New York magazine, and there's like Rufus Wainwright, and Isabella Rossellini, and I was just like, come on, this is crazy. It's like
I love that dress that she was wearing, though.
I mean, too, it was amazing. I mean, it's like it becomes a kind of, the whole thing became about kind of aesthetics in a really bizarre way. That the earlier work had been much more. I don't know, I just had mixed feelings about it. I think she's a super important figure, and I was really glad to see the museum recognize her, but I also find it very complicated what it means to kind of polish that work and embalm it within the institution. It changes the nature of the work.
I worked for an artist in Myanmar who did like a postmodern counter argument to that exhibit, specifically called The Other Artist is Present, and she showed up. And then there's like one of the stills on the site is like them looking at each other, and he's wearing this amazing dress. And he politicized it because he's Iranian and Canadian, so he's like doing chanting and he's doing, but it's related to durational. Because the exhibit that he did asked the question that you just asked, like how come you're in here?
The best response I saw was like, there was like I don't know if it's still up, but like it was like, how long would you last sitting next to her? And there's just like a collection of people crying, you know, like how long could it take before you would just bawl?
Wow.
It's so, I mean, there's also, you know, social sculpture. Do you guys know Grittier Venetia, art school with whatever? There's like a whole wave of this work that I find really interesting because it's work that came out of the 60s. It's a conceptual adversarial art practice that was meant to turn things on its head. But now the art world, everything is commodified within the art world. There is no outside the institution. So what does adversarial? That's why Gran Fury was like, this is too complicated. We can't do this. And I just think it's a legitimate, and I mean this is a sincere question. What is an adversarial practice within, you know what I mean, unless it's on the margins? And then are we just wrong? And then must you stay on the margins? In other words, I choose to make narrative feature films to not be on the margins and to make a sort of adversarial work within a mainstream form. If I'm successful or not successful, I don't know. That's not up for me to judge. But I think it's a really interesting question. It's sort of a central question. I don't think as artists and makers or writers, we can retreat to the so-called margins. occupy those spaces as the only spaces of strategic intervention, because they're so well known and well trapped already that you have to find a different way to intervene. What's not clear to me is how do you find those ways to intervene? How do you go into straight through the doors of power and make a critique or deal with it? It's really complicated. All right, food for thought.